The kitchen was small, the kind of place where the hum of the refrigerator filled the silence more than conversation ever did. Marcus Williams sat hunched at the table, the late afternoon light cutting across his dark brown skin, tracing the deep lines of 65 years. His hands, calloused and rough, cradled a chipped coffee mug. Steam curled upward, dissolving into the still air. The ring of the phone shattered the quiet. At first he ignored it. Calls rarely brought good news, and after decades of being overlooked, dismissed, or pitied, Marcus had learned to expect little from the world. But the ringing persisted, shrill and insistent, echoing through the empty apartment like a demand he could not escape. With a heavy sigh, he rose and lifted the receiver. Marcus Williams speaking. The voice on the other end was precise, polished, practiced. Mr. Williams, this is Margaret Blake from Blake & Associates Attorneys at Law. I'm calling regarding Mrs. Clara Mitchell. Marcus froze. That name, Clara, his ex-wife. The woman who had once looked at him with fire in her eyes, who later looked at him like a liability she had to shed. His throat tightened. What about her? There was a pause, the kind reserved for words that could not be softened. I'm very sorry to inform you, sir. Mrs. Mitchell passed away 2 days ago. The funeral will be held this Friday, followed by a reading of the will. You are requested to attend. The words landed like stones. Marcus sank into his chair. The receiver pressed to his ear, his breath suddenly shallow. The light through the window shifted, glinting off his skin in a way that made him feel exposed, vulnerable. Clara was gone. He set the mug down, his hand trembling. For years he had lived in her shadow, a man dismissed as unworthy by her friends, her colleagues, even their son. To them, Marcus was never more than a black man who had married above his station, a reminder of choices Clara was expected to outgrow. He remembered the whispers at business dinners, the tight smiles, the condescending nods from men who thought money excused their arrogance. And now, after all those years of silence, she had remembered him in her will. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice rough. I don't think... There must be some mistake. Why me, Mr. Williams? The lawyer said gently. Your presence is specifically required. Mrs. Mitchell left instructions. You are a named beneficiary. Beneficiary. The word tasted foreign, almost mocking. He hung up after confirming the details, the silence returning to his apartment. But it wasn't the same silence anymore. It pressed down on him, filled with memories he had tried to bury: Clara's laughter, Clara's ambition, Clara's sharp words the night she walked out for the last time. Marcus rubbed his face, the coarse texture of his beard scratching his palm. On his wall, the old photograph of him as a young man, tall, broad-shouldered, his skin radiant under the Wyoming sun, stared back like a stranger he once knew. A man who had believed love could survive the world's scorn. Now, all that remained was the echo of her name and the weight of a phone call that refused to leave his chest. Marcus whispered into the empty room, his voice trembling, but steady enough to be heard by the ghosts of the past. Clara, why me? After all this time, why me? The only answer was silence stretching into the night. It was winter in Denver, 1983, the kind of cold that left the air brittle and sharp. Marcus remembered it like a film he could replay at will the night he first saw Clara Mitchell. He had ducked into a diner on Colfax Avenue, the kind of place where the coffee was weak but hot, and the pie was always a little too sweet. He was 25, then skin smooth and deep like polished mahogany, wearing a second-hand coat that couldn't quite keep out the wind. The moment he walked in, he felt the shift heads turned. Conversations faltered, eyes lingered too long. He knew that look. Black man in the wrong place. Marcus ignored it, sliding into a booth near the window. He kept his gaze low, used to blending into the background when he needed to. But that night was different. At the counter, a woman in a red wool coat stood with her back straight, her blonde hair spilling over her shoulders. She wasn't ordering. She was arguing with the manager. You're telling me you won't even consider black applicants for a manager position? Her voice cut through the clinking of dishes sharp and clear. That's not just outdated, it's disgraceful. Marcus froze the fork in his hand, hovering over the apple pie. A white woman calling out discrimination in public. The room had gone stiff. The manager shifted uncomfortably, muttering something about company policy. She didn't let it slide. "No, what you mean is prejudice wrapped up as policy. And if that's how you run your business, then you'll never see my face or my money again." Marcus couldn't help it. A smile tugged at his lips. She was fearless, beautiful in her defiance. When she turned slightly, their eyes met. For a heartbeat, it felt like the rest of the diner disappeared. Her gaze lingered, curious, unflinching, on his dark skin, as if acknowledging what the others refused to see. Then she walked out, the chime of the doorbells marking her exit. On the counter, she left a business card. Clara Mitchell, business consultant. Marcus's chest tightened. He didn't know why, but he memorized that name, that card, the curve of her jaw under the harsh fluorescent lights. Something told him this was not the last time their paths would cross. 3 days later, he found the courage to call. "Clara Mitchell," she answered briskly, her voice confident. Hello. My name is Marcus Williams. We haven't met properly. I was in the diner on Friday night. You left a business card." A pause, then a laugh, rich and unexpected. "You're the man with the apple pie," the one who looked like he wanted to say something but didn't. Marcus chuckled softly, scratching his neck. "I guess I was too stunned to speak. You reminded me of fire walking into a room full of smoke." There was silence, then a softer tone. "Well, Marcus Williams, do you always compliment strangers this boldly? Only the ones worth remembering." The line went quiet for a beat. Then dinner. Romano's 7th Avenue. Saturday, 7 o'clock. Don't be late. And just like that, a chapter began. Marcus hung up, staring at the receiver in disbelief. A black man raised to believe the world had boundaries he could never cross had just been invited into the orbit of a woman who challenged those very boundaries with every word she spoke. That night, for the first time in years, Marcus dared to dream of something bigger than survival. Romano's was dimly lit, the kind of restaurant that tried to pass itself off as upscale with red candles and heavy curtains. Marcus arrived 10 minutes early, smoothing down the collar of his only good shirt, the one his mother had ironed flat the last time he wore it to church. He sat stiffly at the table, aware of how his dark skin stood out in the sea of pale faces around him. When Clara walked in, the room seemed to shift. She wore the same red wool coat, but beneath it a black dress that shimmered against the candlelight. Heads turned not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because of who she chose to walk toward, him. Marcus rose, pulling out her chair the way his father had taught him. He caught the looks from nearby tables, surprised, disapproving, some openly hostile. He'd lived with those stares his whole life, but this was the first time he felt protective, not just for himself, but for her. "You're early," Clara said, settling into her seat with a confident smile. "Didn't want to risk missing this," Marcus replied, his deep voice carrying both nerves and certainty. They ordered wine, and for 3 hours they talked. About her childhood in Denver, his in a small town in Alabama, where Sunday church was the only escape from 6-day work weeks. About books, music, their dreams. Clara was fierce and funny, her laughter spilling across the table like sunlight. Marcus found himself saying things he hadn't shared with anyone, how he'd always wanted to start a small repair shop, how being the only black engineer at the plant meant working twice as hard for half the recognition. When he admitted that, Clara leaned forward, her green eyes steady. "That's not fair, Marcus. You deserve better." He almost laughed because fairness wasn't a word that ever belonged to men like him. But the way she said it, like it was fact and not wishful thinking, stirred something deep inside him. As the night drew on, Clara reached across the table, her pale hand covering his dark one. "I like you," she said simply. The restaurant seemed to freeze. Marcus noticed the waiter pause mid-step. Another diner glance up sharply, as if their touch broke some unspoken rule. He wanted to pull away to avoid the weight of those eyes, but he didn't. He held her hand firmly, meeting her smile with one of his own. From that night, their lives intertwined. There were late walks through city streets, her arm hooked through his as if daring the world to challenge her. There were quiet mornings in his modest apartment where she teased him about the broken faucet, and he teased her about the way she burned toast. But the whispers began almost immediately. Her parents, wealthy and proper, invited Marcus to dinner once. The cold politeness was worse than open hostility. Her mother's forced smile never reached her eyes. Her father's questions about Marcus's background carried the sting of judgment. Later, Clara told him, "They don't understand. They still live in another century." Marcus only nodded. He'd heard it all before. He knew it wasn't just another century, it was this one too. At work, Clara's colleagues made comments behind her back, assuming Marcus wouldn't hear. "Ambitious girl," one of them sneered at a party. "But she's wasting her potential." Clara confronted them once, but Marcus pulled her aside. "You don't have to fight my battles," he told her gently. "Yes, I do." She shot back, her jaw set. "Because they're our battles now." That night, as they lay together, Marcus stared at the ceiling. He wanted to believe love could conquer everything. The stares, the whispers, the quiet violence of a world that didn't want them together. Clara's head rested on his chest, her pale skin against his dark, a contrast that made him ache with both pride and fear. He kissed her hair and whispered, "Forever, right?" She murmured sleepily, "Forever." But even in that tender silence, Marcus felt the weight of the world pressing in, reminding him that forever was a promise the world would never allow easily. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and coffee gone cold. Marcus paced the corridor, his broad shoulders tense, his dark skin gleaming with sweat under the harsh fluorescent lights. He had worked double shifts all week just to earn time off for this day, the day his child would enter the world. When the nurse finally emerged smiling, he felt his knees weaken. "Congratulations, Mr. Williams. It's a boy." The words cracked something open inside him. Marcus stumbled into the room, his heart pounding. Clara lay on the bed, exhausted but radiant, her blonde hair damp with sweat. In her arms rested a tiny bundle wrapped in pale blue. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling, "meet David." He leaned down and his rough, calloused hands trembled as he touched his son's small fingers. The baby's skin was lighter than his, darker than Clara's, a shade between two worlds. The child opened his eyes briefly, and Marcus felt something ignite in his chest. This was his legacy, his hope, the proof that love could create something stronger than prejudice. For a moment it was perfect, but perfection never lasted long. Later, when Clara's parents arrived, Marcus saw their faces freeze at the sight of the baby. Her mother's smile faltered. Her father cleared his throat too loudly. They murmured polite congratulations, but their eyes told the truth. The child was not one of theirs, not fully. That night, Marcus overheard Clara's father in the hallway, speaking to her in a harsh whisper. "This is the life you chose, raising a child who will never be accepted. Do you have any idea what people will say?" Clara's voice was sharp, defiant. "People can say whatever they want. He's my son, our son." But Marcus heard the tremor beneath her anger. He knew how much she craved approval, how much she built her life on winning respect in rooms that barely allowed women, let alone women who married black men. As David grew, the cracks widened. At the park, mothers gathered their children when Marcus pushed the stroller past. At daycare, whispers circled when Clara dropped David off the staff, politely but pointedly asking if Marcus was really the father. At home, Marcus sang to his son, teaching him lullabies his mother had hummed in Alabama. He wanted David to know his heritage, to feel pride in the skin that would always set him apart. But when Marcus spoke of teaching David fishing or telling him stories of his ancestors, Clara's lips tightened. "Marcus," she said once, her voice careful, "he doesn't need all that. He needs to learn how to succeed, how to fit in." Fit in, where Marcus shot back, in a world that already decided what he is before he can even talk. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with everything they could not say. Still, Marcus clung to hope. On David's first birthday, he held his son high in the air, his deep voice ringing with joy. "Look at you, little man. You're going to grow up strong, smarter than me, braver than me." Clara smiled, snapping photos. For that instant, the three of them seemed like any family bound by love rather than divided by color. But outside the frame of that picture, Marcus already felt the tension building. He knew the world would not forgive their child for being both, and feared that one day Clara herself might not forgive it either. As he kissed David's small forehead, Marcus whispered a vow only the baby could hear. "No matter what they say, You'll always know where you come from. You'll always know your father's love. He meant it with everything he was. But promises like love were fragile things when weighed against the world's prejudice. The new house smelled of fresh paint and polished wood. Sunlight poured through wide windows glinting off marble counters and polished floors. Clara walked through the rooms with a triumphant smile, her heels clicking sharply, her blonde hair tied back like a woman already in command of the future. "This is it, Marcus," she said, spreading her arms. "Our new life." Marcus trailed behind his work boots, squeaking against the glossy tiles. He ran his rough fingers across the spotless counter, feeling more out of place than proud. He still smelled faintly of machine oil from the plant, his dark skin glistening with sweat after a long shift. Standing in this gleaming house, he felt like a shadow smudging a perfect painting. David, now 7, darted from room to room, his laughter echoing in the empty halls. He stopped in the corner bedroom, where Clara had already set up a brand-new computer. Not a toy. No, a real machine worth more than Marcus's paycheck for the month. "Mom says this will help me get ahead," David said proudly, his small hands exploring the keys. Marcus knelt beside him, resting a strong hand on his son's shoulder. "We can still go fishing this weekend. I'll show you how my daddy taught me." But David wrinkled his nose. "Fishing's boring, Dad. Mom says I need to focus on things that matter." The words cut deeper than they should have. Marcus forced a smile, hiding the sting. "Things that matter, huh? Well, maybe you'll show me how this machine works then." Clara appeared in the doorway, arms folded. "He needs to understand technology, Marcus. The future won't wait for anyone. You can't expect him to live the way you did." Her voice was calm, but the edge was there, the same one Marcus had grown used to hearing in rooms filled with people who dismissed him for his color, his work, his place in the world. And now he was hearing it at home. Dinner parties began soon after. The long dining table glowed beneath a chandelier that scattered light across crystal glasses and polished silverware. Clara entertained clients, partners, ambitious couples who spoke in a language Marcus couldn't follow. Market shares, hedge funds, expansion strategies. Marcus sat quietly, his broad frame hunched at the end of the table, his deep brown skin stark against a sea of pale faces and pressed suits. When guests asked about his work, Clara would answer for him. "He's at the power plant," she said, her tone polite but tinged with apology, as if his labor was something to excuse. Marcus saw the looks, the subtle nods, the way conversations shifted away from him as though he didn't belong. He would retreat into silence, sipping water, staring at his reflection in the glass table. A man too dark, too ordinary, seated in a house of glass where every flaw showed. David thrived in this new world. At 10, he discussed computer programs with Clara's business friends. At 12, he rolled his eyes when Marcus suggested camping. At 14, he corrected Marcus at restaurants embarrassed by his father's simpler tastes. "Dad doesn't understand" became David's refrain. Each time, Marcus felt the words sink deeper, a wedge driven further between them. He still tried. He brought home fishing rods, baseball gloves, stories of his own father's wisdom. But David's eyes were already elsewhere on Clara, on her world, on the promise of a future where he would never be judged for the color of his skin the way his father had been. But Marcus knew better. He saw the way waiters looked at David when the boy walked into high-end restaurants with him half black, in a suit too fine for his years. He saw the tension in Clara's face when clients glanced at Marcus, then at her son, calculating judging. The house on Hillcrest Avenue sparkled with wealth, but to Marcus, it was a house of glass, fragile, transparent, and always threatening to shatter under the weight of truths nobody wanted to say aloud. One night after the guests had gone, Marcus stood alone in the kitchen. He looked at the spotless counters, the untouched food, the lingering scent of perfume and wine. His reflection stared back at him in the glossy surface, weary and unmoored. When Clara came in, still glowing from the evening, she wrapped her arms around him. "Isn't this wonderful, Marcus? We finally belong." He pulled away gently, his voice low. "You mean you belong, Clara? Me? I'm just the reminder of where you came from. And David, he's caught in the middle." Clara's smile faltered, her eyes flickering with something cold before she turned away. Marcus realized then that the battle was no longer between them and the world. It was seeping into their own home, and the fractures were only beginning to show. David's 15th birthday should have been a celebration. Balloons, laughter, maybe a backyard barbecue with his school friends. That's what Marcus imagined when he picked out a fishing rod wrapped clumsily in newspaper, just like his father once did for him. But when he came home that evening, the backyard was empty. Instead, the living room glowed with rented lights, the dining table stretched with catered food, and the house buzzed with strangers in tailored suits. A jazz quartet played in the corner. The guest list was full of Clara's business associates and their children, polished, polite, already rehearsed in the art of networking. Marcus stood at the edge of the room, his dark skin a shadow among pale faces, his calloused hands shoved into his pockets. He watched as David mingled with men twice his age, speaking with a confidence that didn't sound like him. It sounded like Clara. "Isn't this perfect?" Clara whispered beside him, her green eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "He's making connections that will shape his future." Marcus shook his head slowly. "He's 15, Clara. He should be outside with his friends, not playing host at a corporate gala." She adjusted a centerpiece with practiced precision. "Being just a kid is a luxury, Marcus. We can't afford to let him waste time. The world is too competitive." Marcus felt the words lodge in his chest like stones. He looked at his son, tall for his age, handsome, his skin a shade that marked him as both and neither. For a moment David glanced toward Marcus, the mask slipping, revealing a flicker of loneliness in his eyes. But then Clara placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him back into the crowd, and the mask returned. Later, Marcus found David standing alone by the pool, the music and laughter drifting behind him. "You okay, son?" Marcus asked softly. David straightened his voice, carrying the weary sophistication of someone twice his age. "Of course. Why wouldn't I be?" Marcus wanted to push to remind him that he was still a boy, still allowed to be unsure. But David had already slipped back into the polished persona Clara had shaped. The party ended in applause, handshakes, promises of bright futures. But to Marcus, it felt like a funeral, burying the boy he once knew under layers of ambition that weren't his own. That night, the fight came. Marcus set the unopened fishing rod on the kitchen counter. "Clara, he needs space to grow into himself. You're turning him into something he's not." Clara, still in her elegant dress, didn't look up from her phone. "And what is he?" "Marcus, like you stuck in the past settling for mediocrity. He deserves better." Her words sliced deep. Marcus clenched his fists, his dark skin glistening with sweat. "Mediocrity. I've worked my whole life to give him a home to put food on the table. Don't talk to me about mediocrity." Clara finally looked up, her expression cool, almost pitying. "You don't understand. Success requires sacrifice. You've never been willing to make them." "I sacrificed plenty," Marcus growled. "I sacrificed being seen, being respected just to give us a chance, and all I got in return was being treated like the weight you had to cut loose." The silence that followed was suffocating. David, who had come downstairs for water, froze in the doorway. His eyes flicked between his parents, his face hardening. "You don't get it, Dad," he said coldly. "Mom's right. You settled. I won't make that mistake." The words landed like blows. Marcus saw it clearly. Then the boy he loved, raised between two worlds, had chosen hers. And in that choice was a rejection not just of Marcus's life, but of his skin, his struggles, everything he represented. Clara returned to her phone, dismissing the fight with silence. David turned away, retreating upstairs without a glance back. Marcus stood in the kitchen alone, the unopened gift, staring at him like a cruel joke. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, but inside the cracks had widened. And Marcus knew what was breaking wasn't just a family. It was the fragile hope that love alone could withstand the weight of the world's prejudice. The night Clara told him it was over, Marcus was sitting at the kitchen table, the same place where years earlier they had shared late-night laughter over burnt toast and whispered plans for the future. Now the granite counter gleamed under cold light, and the silence between them was heavier than stone. Clara walked in wearing her business suit, her blonde hair pinned back, her phone in her hand. She didn't even sit. "Marcus." she began, her tone clipped, rehearsed. "This isn't working anymore." Marcus looked up from his coffee, his deep brown skin lined with exhaustion, his shoulders hunched from another double shift. "What isn't working, us, or the fact that I'm not one of your business partners in a suit?" She exhaled sharply, refusing to meet his eyes. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. The company, the clients, they demand everything. I can't afford distractions." "Distractions." His voice rumbled low, dangerous. "That's what you call me. What you call our son." Clara's eyes flicked toward the stairs where David's door was closed. Her jaw tightened. "David is thriving. He's going to places you never could. You should be proud of him." Marcus stood the chair, scraping loudly against the tile. His dark figure loomed, but his voice trembled with hurt, not anger. "Proud. He looks at me like I'm nothing, Clara. Like I'm just some man who doesn't belong in his world. You did that. You taught him that." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You've always played the victim, Marcus, always blaming the world for what you didn't achieve. Maybe it's time to admit we're not the same. You and I, we want different things." "No," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "We are different things. You get to be admired, respected. I walk into a room, and I'm the black man who doesn't fit. And instead of standing by me, you joined them. You left me to carry that weight alone." For a moment something flickered in her green eyes. Guilt, maybe. But it vanished as quickly as it came. "I can't live like this," Clara whispered. "And neither can you. The lawyers will handle everything." The words dropped like a gavel. Marcus felt the air leave his lungs as if the room itself had collapsed. The divorce was quick, brutal. Clara's lawyers carved up the life they had built with clinical precision. Marcus was left with a modest house, some savings, and the bitter taste of betrayal. Clara kept the company, the wealth, and most painfully David. On the day the papers were signed, Marcus waited outside the courthouse, his broad shoulders slumped, his dark skin glistening in the midday sun. He saw Clara walk away in her tailored suit phone pressed to her ear, already absorbed in her next deal. David followed beside her, a teenager in designer clothes, his face set in stone. Marcus called out softly, "David." The boy paused for a heartbeat, his eyes flicking back. For the briefest moment, Marcus saw the child he once held in his arms, the boy who used to giggle at fishing stories. But then David turned, slipping into the sleek car without a word. The door shut, and the sound echoed like a final verdict. That night, Marcus sat alone in his small house, surrounded by boxes of things nobody else wanted. Old photographs, cracked dishes, the fishing rod still wrapped in paper. He stared at the walls, painted a dull beige, and wondered how love could begin with fire and end in ashes. But the truth cut deeper than lost love. It wasn't just Clara who had left him. It was the world she chose, a world that looked at Marcus's skin and decided he would never be enough. And now even his own son had learned to believe it. The years after the divorce stretched long and gray like winters that never ended. Marcus moved into a modest one-story house on the edge of town, the kind of place where weeds pushed through the sidewalk and neighbors barely nodded in passing. Inside, the walls were bare except for a few photographs he couldn't bring himself to pack away. Clara on their wedding day, radiant in white. David, at 5 years old, perched on Marcus's shoulders, grinning with both front teeth missing. Each picture was a wound that never healed. Marcus filled the silence with work. He stayed at the power plant where the heat of machinery felt more honest than human conversation. The other workers respected him quietly without fanfare. He was reliable, steady, the kind of man who showed up early and left late. But outside the plant, he was invisible. To the wealthy world, Clara had climbed into Marcus was just a forgotten name, a black man with calloused hands and nothing to offer. Sundays were the hardest. He'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, the sunlight warming his dark skin, and wait for a phone call that never came. Sometimes he imagined David's voice on the other end. "Hey, Dad, want to go fishing?" But the phone stayed silent. When he did see his son, it was only at a distance. Once Marcus caught sight of David in a glossy magazine spread. Clara's company had been featured, and there was David, 17, now standing tall beside her, wearing a suit that fit him too perfectly. His smile was polished, his posture confident, but Marcus saw the hollowness in his eyes. At the grocery store, Marcus overheard whispers. "That's him, isn't it? The one she left." Others were harsher. "He dragged her down for years. She finally got rid of the dead weight." He pretended not to hear, but the words stuck like thorns. He knew how the world saw him, not as a man who had loved deeply, but as a mistake Clara had outgrown. Still, he carried on. He mowed his own lawn, fixed his own leaky pipes, cooked simple meals for one. At night he sat by the window, the glow of the streetlight casting shadows across his brown skin, and thought about what might have been. Sometimes he took out the fishing rod he'd bought for David. He'd run his hand over the smooth wood, remembering the promise he had whispered when his son was a baby. "You'll always know your father's love." But the rod remained unused, gathering dust in the corner. The loneliness wasn't just absence, it was a presence heavy and constant. It whispered to him in the stillness, reminding him of every failure, every look of disappointment on Clara's face, every moment when David's eyes had turned cold. And yet, beneath it all, Marcus held on to something small but unbreakable dignity. He refused to let bitterness consume him. He greeted neighbors politely, even when they looked through him. He volunteered once a month at the community center, helping kids with their homework, because he couldn't help his own son anymore. Life became routine, measured in cups of coffee and quiet evenings. But sometimes late at night, Marcus would look at the photographs and feel a flicker of the man he once was, the man who believed love could defy the world's prejudice. It was that flicker, fragile but alive, that kept him from collapsing entirely. He didn't know it yet, but the world hadn't finished with him. The silence he endured was only the calm before the storm that would pull him back into Clara's orbit and force him to face everything he thought he had lost. The chapel stood on the hill like a monument to wealth-stained glass windows, casting colored light across mahogany pews, lilies arranged with artistic precision. Luxury cars lined the circular drive, their polished exteriors gleaming in the gray morning light. Marcus pulled his old Honda into the last empty space, the engine rattling as if to betray him. He stepped out slowly, adjusting his second-hand suit. His dark skin, weathered and proud, seemed to absorb the curious glances of the mourners as he walked toward the doors. Inside, the hum of conversation floated through the air, a mixture of grief and networking. Men in tailored suits clasped hands. Women in black silk whispered behind manicured nails. Marcus slipped into the back pew, hoping to be invisible. But invisibility was never granted to him. It was forced on him when convenience stripped from him when it meant mockery. A woman nudged her companion, eyes flicking toward Marcus. "That's him, the ex-husband." "I heard he held her back for years," the man whispered back. "She could have been even greater if not for him." Marcus bowed his head, hands clasped tight, letting the words pass over him like bitter rain. He had grown used to carrying blame. Then a voice cut through the chapel, sharp and familiar. "Dad!" Marcus looked up. David stood in the aisle, tall and commanding in a tailored suit, his skin a lighter reflection of Marcus's own. At 37, he carried himself with Clara's poise, her ambition radiating from him like heat. "What are you doing here?" David's voice echoed, drawing heads toward them. "I came to pay my respects," Marcus said quietly, rising to his feet. "You lost that right the day you left her." David stepped closer, his words loud enough for the whole room. "She wouldn't have wanted you here." A murmur swept through the crowd. The congregation was no longer mourning. They were watching, waiting, hungry for spectacle. Marcus held his son's gaze, the weight of every judgment pressing down on him. "Maybe not, but I needed to be here." David's lips curled into a sneer. "For what?" "To ease your conscience. To play the grieving widower in front of people who know exactly what kind of husband you were." Marcus felt the sting, but he didn't flinch. "Not this time. I loved your mother, David, for 22 years as her husband and for the rest of my life, even after she walked away." The chapel fell silent. Marcus's deep voice carried steady and unyielding, filling the space that had so often excluded him. But David wasn't finished. He turned to the mourners like a prosecutor addressing a jury. This man spent 2 decades dragging her down. While she built an empire, he punched a time clock. He settled for mediocrity. And now he dares to show up here pretending he mattered. Some nodded. Others avoided Marcus's eyes. The words were knives, but Marcus stood his ground. His dark skin glistened under the stained glass light, and for once he refused to shrink. "I'm not here to claim her success," Marcus said quietly. "I'm here because once she loved me, and I will honor that even if none of you understand." David faltered just for a moment, the mask slipping. But then he straightened, his voice rising again. "You don't belong here. Leave before you embarrass yourself further." Marcus sat back down slowly, folding his large hands in his lap. "No, son. I'm staying. I won't be erased, not today." The funeral director stepped forward, trying to restore order, but the moment had already left its mark. In the whispers that followed, Marcus felt the same sting he had known his whole life, the sting of being judged not just as a failed husband, but as a black man, in a world that never wanted to see him as equal. And yet beneath the weight of humiliation, something inside him hardened. He would endure this moment just as he had endured all the others, because the truth buried and waiting had not yet been revealed. The lawyer's office was nothing like Marcus expected. No glass towers or gleaming lobbies, just a Victorian house converted into a law firm, the air heavy with the scent of polished wood and old books. The kind of place Clara would have chosen, respectable, traditional, wrapped in quiet power. Marcus sat stiffly in a leather chair, his dark hands resting on his knees, his broad frame filling the space uneasily. To his left, David sprawled confidently, his tailored suit sharp, his pale skin glowing under the afternoon light. He looked like the heir apparent, the man certain of his place in the world. Across the desk, Attorney Blake adjusted his glasses, opening a thick folder with deliberate precision. "This is the last will and testament of Mrs. Clara Mitchell," he began, his voice calm, practiced. David leaned forward, anticipation gleaming in his eyes. Marcus braced himself for confirmation of what he already knew, that he didn't belong in this room, that his presence was a formality, that Clara's empire would pass to the son she had raised to reflect her ambition. The lawyer cleared his throat. "To my beloved son, David Mitchell, I leave the family residence at Hillcrest Avenue along with all furnishings and personal property contained therein. Additionally, I bequeath the sum of $500,000. David's smile flickered at the edges. The house, the money, yes, impressive, but not nearly the scale he expected. He shifted in his seat, and the company Blake did not answer immediately. He turned another page, his voice steady. "The inheritance for David is contingent upon his continued employment with Mitchell and Associates for a minimum of 2 years following the execution of this will. Contingent." David repeated, his voice sharp. "Why would she—" The lawyer raised a hand. "Please allow me to finish." Marcus felt the room tilt as Blake's gaze shifted toward him. "To my former husband, Marcus Elijah Williams." The air seemed to collapse. David's head snapped around, eyes narrowing in disbelief. "I bequeath the controlling interest in Mitchell and Associates, including all subsidiary companies' real estate holdings and business assets. In addition, I leave the sum of $33 million to be transferred from my investment accounts." The words landed like a thunderclap. Marcus's mouth fell open. His dark skin flushed with heat, his large hands gripping the armrests to steady himself. $33 million. The company. Clara's empire, the very thing she once chose over him, was now his. David shot to his feet, his face pale, then crimson. "This is insane. She would never. She couldn't." Blake remained calm, adjusting his glasses again. Mrs. Mitchell reviewed these documents thoroughly. She was of sound mind and left explicit instructions. "There is no mistake." Marcus shook his head slowly, his deep voice barely a whisper. "I don't understand." "Why me?" David slammed a fist onto the desk, his voice breaking with rage. "You don't deserve it. You never belonged in her world. She built everything, and you just stood in her shadow. And now you expect me to believe she gave it all to you." The lawyer's tone sharpened. "Enough. These were Mrs. Mitchell's final wishes, and they are legally binding." The office fell silent except for the faint ticking of a clock. Marcus sat frozen, his heart pounding his mind, struggling to reconcile the impossible truth. For years he had been invisible, dismissed, humiliated. And now Clara's final act had thrust him back into the center of everything. Across the desk, David's chest rose and fell with furious breaths, his blue eyes blazing. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice shaking with both rage and fear. "You think this makes you a man? You think money erases who you are? You'll never be anything but a reminder of her mistake." Marcus met his son's glare. For the first time in years, he didn't shrink. His dark eyes held steady, his voice low but firm. "I didn't ask for this, David. But maybe your mother finally saw the truth that worth isn't measured in wealth, but in the lives we choose to honor." David's face twisted, and he turned away sharply, pacing like a caged animal. The lawyer closed the folder gently, the echo final. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is only the beginning. Mrs. Mitchell left a message to be read after the will. She wanted both of you to hear it." Marcus's chest tightened. A message, Clara's voice reaching from beyond the grave, and for the first time since the call that shattered his quiet life, Marcus felt the weight of not just money or power, but of truth pressing down on him. David's chair scraped violently against the wooden floor as he stood, his fists trembling at his sides. The veins in his neck bulged, his pale skin flushed crimson against the starched white collar of his shirt. "This is fraud!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the paneled walls. She was manipulated. She was pressured. "You?" He jabbed a finger toward Marcus. "You must have gotten to her somehow." Marcus sat stunned, his broad shoulders heavy, his dark hands gripping the armrests as if they were the only solid things in the room. $33 million, controlling interest in the company that had devoured his marriage. It didn't feel real. His voice came out low, unsteady. "David, I haven't spoken to your mother in 15 years. I didn't do anything." "Liar!" David roared, slamming his palm down on the lawyer's desk. Papers fluttered like startled birds. "Nobody gives away their entire empire to an ex-husband who did nothing." "She must have been sick, confused." "Mr. Mitchell." Attorney Blake cut in sharply, his professional calm finally cracking. "Your mother was evaluated by independent doctors before signing this will. She was of sound mind and very clear about her intentions." David laughed bitterly, but the sound broke midway, jagged and hollow. "Sound mind. Then why would she betray me? I am her son. I am the one who carried her name, her legacy, not him." Marcus lifted his eyes slowly, the deep brown gaze that had once melted with warmth, now firm, unshaken. "She didn't betray you, David. She chose differently than you expected. That's not the same thing." David spun on him, eyes blazing with contempt. "Don't you dare lecture me. You never belonged in her world. You embarrassed her. You embarrassed me every time you opened your mouth. You were just a black man lucky enough to be tolerated by her family until she realized you were dead weight. And now what, you get to sit there and act like you earned this." The words stung sharper than knives, but Marcus didn't flinch. He had lived too long with the poison of prejudice to let it break him now. His voice was steady, though it carried the weight of decades. "I never asked for this, David. I never wanted her company, her money. All I ever wanted was to be your father." For a flicker, Marcus saw it, the boy he once held, the boy who had laughed at fishing stories. But the flicker died quickly, consumed by years of resentment. "You'll never be my father," David hissed. "Not in the way that mattered. Mom built something and you tried to drag her down with your small life, your small dreams. And now you want me to believe she just handed it all over to you? No, I won't accept it." His voice cracked, and the fury twisted into something rawer, a wound torn open in front of them all. Attorney Blake cleared his throat, lifting an envelope marked in Clara's elegant handwriting. "Your mother anticipated this reaction," he said quietly. "She left a personal message addressed to both of you. I believe it may explain her reasoning." David's breath came in ragged gasps. He turned away, fist-clenched shoulders trembling beneath his tailored suit. Marcus sat frozen, his dark skin glistening with a sheen of sweat, his heart pounding. A message from Clara, her last words, her final judgment. He wasn't sure if he wanted to hear it, but he knew there was no turning back now. Attorney Blake unfolded the cream-colored stationery with care, the sound of paper filling the silence like a drumbeat. The handwriting was unmistakable, Clara's bold, elegant strokes, each letter sharp and deliberate. "My dearest Marcus Blake," began reading aloud. Marcus's breath caught. Hearing her words after so many years was like a ghost pressing a hand against his chest. "If you are hearing this, it means I am gone. And you are sitting there, no doubt confused, maybe even angry. I know you believe you don't deserve what I've left you. But you do. You always did." Marcus's vision blurred. His dark hands trembled in his lap. "I never stopped loving you," Blake continued. "Not during the fights, not during the divorce, not during the long silence. You were the one who taught me the meaning of integrity, of strength without cruelty. I was too proud to admit it then, but I see it now. I lost my way. I let ambition and society's approval matter more than the love we built together." David shifted sharply in his chair, his jaw tight, his pale skin flushed red. "Marcus, the letter said you carried burdens. I never acknowledged the stares, the whispers, the quiet violence of prejudice. I thought if I built enough walls of success we could outrun it. Instead, I let those walls trap me, and I let them separate us. You tried to save us, and I was too blind to listen." Marcus pressed his fist against his mouth, fighting to hold back the sob rising in his throat. Then Blake's voice shifted. "David, my son." David's head snapped up. His blue eyes locked on the letter as if it were a blade aimed at him. "You are brilliant, capable, and I have no doubt you will achieve great things. But you are not ready for the empire I built. Not yet. You grew up surrounded by privilege, protected from the battles that shaped me and your father. You accepted the benefits without learning the responsibility." David's lips parted, his face pale. "More than that," the letter continued, "you spent your life resenting your father for being what the world tried to convince you was less. But you never saw what I saw. Marcus was never less. He was more because he lived with dignity when others tried to strip it from him. Because he taught me in the quiet moments that character matters more than ambition." David's hands shook violently. "That's not true," he whispered, but his voice faltered. "You will still inherit enough to live comfortably." David, Clara's letter went on. "But I am leaving the company and the majority of my fortune to your father, not to punish you, but to protect you. Wealth without wisdom is a chain, not a gift. I want you to learn who you are without it. Build something of your own from your own sweat and choices. Only then will you understand what it means to lead." Blake paused, his eyes flicking up. The silence in the room was thick, suffocating. Marcus sat frozen, tears streaking his dark cheeks, while David's chest rose and fell in uneven bursts. The lawyer read the final words. "Marcus, use this gift wisely. Use it for good. Use it to heal what I broke. I trust you because you never wanted it, and that is why you are the one who deserves it. And David, forgive me. One day I hope you will see that this was not betrayal. It was love, the only way I knew how to give it at the end." The room fell silent as Blake folded the pages carefully, sliding them back into the envelope. Marcus pressed his hand over his heart, the weight of Clara's words pressing deeper than any fortune could. For years he had been dismissed, erased, forgotten. Now in her last act, Clara had restored him, his worth, his dignity, his place. David sat rigid, his face pale, his jaw trembling. For the first time the mask of confidence cracked, and beneath it was not just fury, but pain. And in that silence, Marcus realized that the battle was no longer about money or power. It was about truth, the truth of who he was, who his son had become, and whether forgiveness was even possible. The office was silent, except for the faint ticking of the antique clock on the wall. Marcus sat motionless, Clara's letter still echoing in his chest, like a heartbeat he couldn't quiet. His dark hands trembled against his knees, the tears drying on his cheeks, leaving faint trails that shimmered in the afternoon light. For 15 years he had lived in the shadows, dismissed as a failure, painted as the man who couldn't keep up with a brilliant woman. And now, with ink and memory, Clara had given him back something more valuable than wealth, his dignity. Across from him, David's composure cracked. His pale skin had lost its color, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched. He leaned forward, his voice low and jagged, more a plea than an accusation. She called you worthy. She called you strong. But where was that when I was growing up? Where was she when I needed her to believe in me?" Marcus lifted his gaze, his deep brown eyes heavy with both sorrow and understanding. "She believed in you, David. But she also saw what you didn't, that you were being consumed by the same ambition that consumed her. She wanted more for you than a life lived in her shadow." David shot to his feet, pacing like a caged animal. No, you don't understand. I was her legacy. Everything I did, everything I became, it was for her. And now she says, I'm not ready. That you of all people deserve what she built." His voice cracked raw and broken. "You didn't even fight for her, Dad. You let her walk away. You let me walk away." Marcus inhaled sharply, the weight of those words cutting deeper than any insult. He rose slowly, his tall frame casting a shadow across the room. His dark skin glowed faintly under the lamplight, strong, unyielding. "You're right," he said softly. "I let her go. I let you go, because she chose a world where I was never meant to belong. And you," his voice faltered, then steadied, "you chose her world too. I thought maybe one day you'd come back to me, see me for who I am, not what the world told you I was. But that day never came." David stopped pacing, his chest heaving. His eyes, mirrors of Clara's, filled with something Marcus hadn't seen in years: fear. "What am I supposed to do now?" David whispered, his voice cracking. "If I'm not her heir, if I'm not the future she promised, then what am I?" Marcus's heart clenched. For all the venom, all the years of silence, what stood before him now wasn't a rival or an enemy. It was his son, lost angry, broken under the weight of expectations he never chose. "You're my son," Marcus said, his deep voice trembling. "That's what you are, and that's always been enough for me." For a flicker of a moment, the wall between them seemed to tremble. David's face softened, his lips parting as though he might finally let the weight fall. But then pride surged back and the mask snapped into place. "No," David spat, though his voice wavered. "You'll never be enough. Not for me." He grabbed his coat, his movements jerky, desperate, and stormed toward the door. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, fading into silence. Marcus stood frozen in the middle of the office, the echo of his son's rejection ringing louder than Clara's bequest. He looked at Attorney Blake, who was quietly gathering the documents, his expression heavy with sympathy. Mr. Williams Blake said gently, "Sometimes the truth takes longer to settle than the money does. Give him time." But Marcus knew time was no guarantee. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling Clara's words there, etched like scars and blessings both. He had inherited a fortune, a company, a second chance. But what he wanted most, the love of his son, remained just out of reach, and that absence, sharper than any wealth, was the wound that refused to close. The hallway outside the lawyer's office was narrow, lined with photographs of judges and handshake symbols of law and order. But there was no order in David. He stood there waiting, shoulders heaving, his pale skin, flushed eyes burning with fury. Marcus stepped out quietly, his tall frame filling the dim corridor. His dark skin gleamed faintly under the overhead lights, his expression weary but steady. David spun on him. "Do you think this makes you the better man now? Sitting in there acting calm while they hand you everything she built?" Marcus met his glare with silence, at first the weight of years pressing between them. Finally, his deep voice cut through the tension. "I never wanted her empire, David. I never wanted her money. All I ever wanted was to be your father." David's laugh was harsh, jagged. "Father? You think showing up with fishing rods and cheap stories made you a father? No. Mom made me who I am. She gave me the world. And you," his voice cracked venom dripping from each word, "you gave me nothing." The words struck like a whip. Marcus's fists clenched at his sides, the veins in his forearms tight beneath his dark skin. But when he spoke, his tone was calm, almost sorrowful. "I gave you my love, David. I gave you every piece of myself I could, even when you pushed it away. You just never thought it was enough, because the world told you a black man's love isn't worth much." David flinched, his jaw tightening. "Don't you dare turn this into a race issue. This is about ambition, about success, about being more than average. You settled for scraps, and now you want to pretend dignity feeds people, pays bills, builds companies. Marcus stepped closer, his deep brown eyes locked onto his son's. Dignity builds men, and men build everything else. Without it, success is just another mask. For a heartbeat, the hallway fell silent. Marcus's breath was steady. David's was ragged. Then David shoved him hard. Marcus stumbled back against the wall, the thud echoing down the corridor. The lawyer's assistant peeked out from a doorway, wide-eyed, then quickly disappeared. Marcus straightened slowly, his broad chest rising. His voice rumbled like distant thunder. "You can hit me if you want. You can scream curse spit in my face, but it won't change the truth. Your mother chose me, not because I was perfect, but because I never forgot what mattered." David's face twisted, torn between rage and grief. His voice broke high and raw. "Then why wasn't it me? Why wasn't I enough?" The words cracked through Marcus like glass shattering. For the first time he saw not a rival, not an enemy, but the boy he had once lifted onto his shoulders, the boy who used to laugh at fireflies and call him hero. Marcus's eyes softened. "You were always enough, son. You just never believed it, because she never told you in time. And now you're angry at me for a wound I didn't make." David's hands shook violently, his chest rising and falling with sobs he refused to release. He shook his head, backing away, his voice trembling. No, I can't." He turned sharply, storming down the corridor, the sound of his shoes fading into the night. Marcus stood alone, his dark silhouette framed by the sterile lights. He pressed his palm against the wall to steady himself, the weight of Clara's letter still heavy in his pocket. He had won an empire, yes, but he had lost his son again this time, not to ambition, but to anger too deep to heal with words. And as Marcus stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights glittering in the distance, he realized that wealth could buy him many things, but not the one thing he longed for most, not forgiveness. The sun hung low over the city, painting the streets in gold and shadow. Marcus walked out of the lawyer's office with the envelope pressed firmly against his chest. Inside were the documents that made him a wealthy man, controlling interest in Clara's empire, $33 million in assets, and a letter that weighed more than all of it combined. For years he had lived on the edges of life, dismissed, diminished, defined by what he wasn't. Now, in one impossible turn, Clara had pulled him back into the center. But the victory was hollow. Marcus stood beside his aging Honda in the parking lot, staring at the rows of polished black sedans and gleaming Teslas that reflected the late afternoon light. Those cars belonged to Clara's world, to David's world, a world that had never opened its doors to him except to remind him he didn't belong. He slid into the driver's seat, the cracked vinyl warm against his dark skin. The engine sputtered to life. Marcus drove through the streets slowly, watching familiar neighborhoods roll by the factory blocks, the worn-down houses, the faces of people who worked hard and were seen even less than he was. As the sun dipped, memories pressed in. Clara in her red coat, fierce and beautiful in that diner. David as a child, his tiny hand gripping Marcus's finger. The long silence after the divorce filled with whispers that painted him as the villain. And now this inheritance, not a reward, but a responsibility. At home, Marcus spread the documents across the kitchen table. The company, the accounts, the holdings, it was all his. Yet as he looked at the numbers, he felt no pride, just weight. His reflection stared back at him in the window, a man with silver hair, his deep brown skin etched with the years his shoulders, broad but heavy. For a long moment he whispered to the empty room, "What do I do with all this, Clara?" The answer came not in words but in memory, Clara's final plea. Use this gift wisely. Use it for good. Marcus closed his eyes. He thought of the young boys at the community center, the ones who reminded him of himself at their age, hungry for guidance, desperate to believe they could be more than what the world said. He thought of the kids who carried skin like his, who would never be invited to the boardrooms Clara had once dominated. Maybe this was the purpose, not to become what Clara had been, but to build what she had never dared, a legacy not of ambition, but of justice. Marcus gathered the papers into neat stacks, his rough hands steady now. He would meet with the company board. Yes, he would learn what it meant to lead an empire, but he would not do it for power or profit. He would do it to open doors where walls had once stood. For the first time in years, Marcus felt something stir in him, a quiet strength, a dignity unshaken by whispers or wealth. Outside, the streetlight flickered on, casting a pale glow through the window. Marcus stood and tucked Clara's letter into his jacket pocket. It was no longer a weight. It was a compass. He had lost Clara. He had lost David for now. But he had not lost himself, and that more than any fortune was the gift she had left him. As he stepped onto the porch, the cool evening air wrapped around him. The world was the same, harsh, divided, unforgiving. But Marcus was not the same. For the first time in his life, he was no longer asking to belong. He was ready to build a place where he and those like him always would.